This is section 6 in Ash Wednesday. Very significant to note that Eliot only has 6 sections. Certainly within biblical thought, the 7th day is the day of rest. The 6 days are the day of work, of bringing into being the new world, the new creation, bringing life, bringing light, bringing fecundity in that sense. So the first 6 sections are very much about the work of the soul, about the work of formation, about understanding those subtle as well as those crude tendencies that can throw us off the trail of life, that prevent us from maturing in terms of the faith journey into the light and life of the Christian pilgrimage itself. And so there is no 7th section. What Eliot is articulating by approaching it in this way is that the place of rest, the place of Sabbath of the soul, only comes when the work of the soul has been done. But that's an ongoing journey. So that's an open-ended project, and much hinges on how courageous and how discerning people, in fact, are going to be in their work with grace in the process of transformation. And so section 6 is a summing up of some of the key points, congealed insightfully, brought together wisely for those who are attempting to grow in a much deeper way, not a sillier way, but in fact in a much more thoughtful way in their faith journey. So let me begin. Section 6 really reverts back to section 1, although I do not hope to return again. So here you have again, as I mentioned the last section, you have the Silent Sisters trying to call people beyond their doubts, their hesitations, their fears, their cynicism, risking moving forward into a deeper understanding of the journey. And yet there's always this pulling back, this tendency not to take the next step because of doubts. And can I in my journey trust those who I'm on the journey with? Can I trust God? And so he starts, although I do not hope to turn again, I don't want to turn back to the Hamlet position in that sense, being paralyzed by doubts and cynicism, although I do not hope to turn. So you can see this tension within him. He doesn't want to go back there, but he knows the appeal, he knows the temptation. There's a certain comfort in cynicism as well, and then using pains of the past and difficult experiences to justify one's doubting, one's skepticism, one's criticism. So although I do not hope to get wavering between the profit and the loss, so people calculating, what am I likely to gain if I go forward? What am I likely to lose? You get the same element in fact, Eliot's classic work before he became a Christian, in The Wasteland, in which one of the chapters is with a chess game, in which people are calculating, what move shall I make next that's going to bring meaning, that's going to win the game in that sense, wavering between profit and loss on this brief transit where the dreams cross. So our life is very short in that sense, 70, less for some, more for others, but it is a brief transit. So what are we going to do in that brief transit? Between where dreams cross, the dreams cross twilight between birth and dying. We all have just a few steps to make on our life journey between the time we are born and the time we are die. Bless me, Father, though I do not wish to wish these things, and he says, from the wide window towards the granite shore. And here you can see when Eliot's earlier book came out in 29 on Dante, he lingers quite a bit with Odysseus, Homer, the Odyssey. And you have two metaphors coming together in terms of formation in this section. Are we going to stay at the wide window, in the comfort of the home of our soul, looking toward the granite shore where we could have sailed, where we might have sailed, where the wide white sails still fly seaward? Interesting two metaphors at work here. You have the sailing heading out into the unpredictable waters of time, the unpredictable weather of time on the ship with other people in that sense. And this is often a part of the journey. as Odysseus himself, as he moved from the Trojan War, increasingly home to Ithaca, where Penelope and Telemachus, his son, was waiting for him. The white sails still fly seaward, seaward flying, unbroken wings. So you have the eagle very much and the ship at work here. So we go back to section number 1, where the eagle seems to be chained, and what are the reasons for being chained. And here we have the boat metaphor as well. So 2 metaphors of the soul as we cross through time in the water of time with others on the boat of our journey itself. This will anticipate Little Gidding in the 4 quartets in many ways. And so the white sails, so the danger is to stand in this expansive window, to look out towards, if we had courage, one of the first cardinal virtues, to overcome doubts, suspicions, cynicism, or we can stay in the room looking at where we might have gone with our hurts, with our struggles, with our doubts. So the white sails still fly seaward, seaward flying, unbroken wings. So unlike the broken wings, the chain wings, now we have the unbroken wings. And so the ship and the eagle come together in terms of the maturing journey. But there's always the temptation to pull back again, and the lost heart stiffens and rejoices. So the danger as people move through the tragedies, the sufferings, the disappointments, the betrayals of life, is the lost heart stiffens, and yet it rejoices in what it can stay with. In the lost lilac and the lost sea voices. So those elements in life in which a person has experienced in many ways, but you can't return to those experiences. And the weak spirit quickens to rebel. And so it's this tornness between looking out in terms of where a person has been, not being trapped in where they have been, or being paralyzed because of painful experiences. The weak spirit quickens to rebel for the bent golden rod and the lost sea smell. So all of those things we nurture and we protect in ourselves that allow us to stay at a certain point in life and not grow and not move on. Quickens to recover the cry of the quail and the whirling plover, and the blind eye creates. So you have a lost heart, you have a weak spirit, you have blind eye. So the eye no more sees properly, the eye of the soul. And so you create empty forms between the ivory gates. So people spin out intellectual ideas about the good life, or how one makes sense of theology, or creeds and confessions. But the actual experience of coming to grips with our interior issues, people don't go there. It's much easier to play the chess game of ideas rather than the internal process of facing the shadow, the darker side within, which our experiences of life can create. So the empty forms between the ivory gates, so this is the ivory gates, are the fact the way into a deeper and a fuller world in which the sailed ship will take us, which the eagle will take us. And so how willing are we to be transformed into that direction? So this is the time of tension between dying and birth. So here you have a contrast with the earlier part of the poem between our life of birth and dying, which is chronological, versus the spiritual understanding of kairos. So there's 2 understandings of birth and dying. There's the chronological one, in which we all inevitably move forward to our death from birth. The other is the spiritual one, in which we begin the process of dying here. So in fact, we are going to be born into our deified and new life in Christ and the church. So this is the tension between dying. What are we to let go of? What are we clinging to, either in the external world, or what is that part of us internally we identify with our identity that we have to die to, let go of? And of course, Lent is very, very much about going to the cross, initially in Ash Wednesday, having the black mark of the cross put on us. And so we're to die to those things. Either externally we may be addicted to, we cling to for meaning, or that very part of us, the very part of us we identify with ourselves that has to die itself. And so this is the time of tension between dying or letting go, and then to the degree we're willing to do that, this is when birth begins of our new being in Christ and the church. The place of solitude where 3 dreams cross: the dream of who we were, that we will be no more, the dream of who we think we are now, and the dream of our future being. And what, of course, he's looking at now, how would we interact with our future self? If our future self came to visit us, what would they say to our present self? Just as what does our present self say to our past self? These are the three dreams of the human journey itself. What we were, what we are, what we will be, based on decisions and integrity in the inner life at the present time. So the place of solitude, this place of quietness, of listening between these three elements of we were, are, will be. And how does that conversation take place in terms of the transformation of our journey? Between the blue rocks, and of course the blue rocks, rock is always the difficult things in life that are hard to get around. Those painful experiences that are like rocks that won't move, but can we get around them? This is always the key of the sailing through time. And blue is the blue rock. So yes, there's the difficulty of the rocks, but they're blue is the color of eternity. So grace of blue getting around the rocks, which are difficult to sail about. And when the voice is shaken from the yew tree, drift away. So what happens when the voices from the yew tree that speak to us, we don't hear them. We don't hear them well. We don't understand them. They drift away and we miss their meaning. Everything hinges on the voices we're willing to listen to in many ways. Let the other yew tree be shaken and reply. So if we don't get it the first time, what the yew tree, the evergreen, is speaking to us, let the other be shaken and reply. Blessed Sister. Very important here in Dante, when he thinks of Blessed Sister and Holy Mother, there's a couple of things here. Of course, he can be thinking of Beatrice, in that sense, or Mary. There's also very much the notion that he doesn't explicitly talk about is Plato's Symposium, where it's Diotima who leads Socrates into a deeper understanding. Socrates knew logic, he knew inductive logic, he knew abductive logic, he understood the nature of arguments, of rational thought, but it was Diotima who took him yet deeper and further. The other person who obviously is implicitly here, along with Beatrice and Mary, is Penelope, in which Odysseus is sailing home. His son Telemachus had no father for 20 years, but Penelope is the faithful woman that Odysseus is always turning to. So in that sense, the Blessed Sister is not only Beatrice and Mary, the ideal worth turning to, the evocation, the calling us into a fuller life, but it's also Penelope who waits faithfully amidst many temptations and struggles. Her son living through very difficult situations as Odysseus sails home on the sea. And then you have Diotima. So this is Blessed Sister. So the important role of obviously women here in calling forth the best, the noblest on the journey home to Ithaca on the one hand, to the New Jerusalem in Dante. And here you have, so Blessed Sister, Holy Mother, Spirit of the Fountain. So here you have Eliot very much moving into an early form of what we would call ecological awareness. Not only is it the word in the previous one, but there's the spirit in the fountain. Do we sense the spirit in the fountain and the spirit of the garden? It's just not a fountain and a garden, but there's life flowing in this reality. Very Celtic in that sense, spirit of the garden. And in this, he says, suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. This is not only intellectual falsehood and getting ideas right and getting creeds and confessions and exegesis and theology, but we can be false to ourselves in terms of our own understanding of what we're to let go of misunderstanding in many ways who we think we are and what we have to die to. So suffer us not, because in that sense we're mocking ourselves. We're making fools of ourselves if we're being false to the meaning of transformation, of dying. He says, suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. And he's talking about transformation here, not the falsehood of ideas. It's the falsehood of self-understanding, or in the classical sense, knowing yourself, or as Jesus would say, love your neighbor as yourself. So suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. Teach us to care and not to care. This goes right back, of course, to section 1. So both care for ourselves, but not take ourselves too seriously. To care for others, but not be drawn into an unhealthy form of caring. And so there are people who I mentioned earlier that can be very empathetic, but they can be drawn into dysfunctional relationships in which they can be burned out. And there can be other people who walk around the edge of suffering and tragedy and they don't care. It's living in the tension of knowing how to care and be taught that. Teach us to care, yet not to care. A difficult tension, a difficult tightrope to walk. And then how does that occur? Again, he goes back to number one, teach us to sit still, which is probably one of the greatest challenges of the modern and late modern world. People can debate about all sorts of hot button issues in the culture wars, whether one is on the right or the left, the progressive or the liberal or the conservative or the reactionary in the center. But virtually many of these various ideological positions are all addicted to the vita activa, the busy, the franticness, the doing, the inability, as he says, teach us to sit still. Probably the most prominent drug of Western civilization is the vita activa, either of the mind or the being busy in our lives, an inability to stay still. And as within the Indian tradition, our mind is almost like monkeys leaping all over, and it's how one stills that and is still. So he says, teach us to sit still, even among these rocks. So we're back again to the image of rocks which can prevent us from sailing to where we're meant to be, back home, to the home of the soul, to the New Jerusalem, to Ithaca, in that sense, or where Diotima was leading Socrates, our peace in his will. So how in sitting still do we really, are we immersed in his will? What does it mean to live in that will? Just as the eagle, when it catches the air currents, there's no effort. Its wings are just spread. It just turns in the air currents. So the will of God is the will of knowing how to sail effortlessly in the wind currents of eternity, our peace. And so we're not struggling anymore when some of these truths are internalized. But then he comes back to earth again, and even among these rocks. So again and again, Eliot's not going to in any way be naive or give people shallow, optimistic answers for the nature of the journey as you move towards the Sabbath, in which he's trying to point towards. There are the rocks. There are the rocks. Sister, mother, he says. Sister and spirit of the river and spirit of the sea. So once again, you see in Eliot the triangular bringing together of God, of humans, and of nature. And there's the spirit in the river, and there's the spirit of the sea. And do we have the ears and the soul to hear that? Are we attentive to that? So as I said, in Eliot, you get this very early form of ecological theology or ecological formation in which who we are in terms of our journey forward is very, very connected to the land, to nature itself, and being able to understand that spirit. So suffer me not to be separated from this greater unity. And then he ends with a quote from Psalm 102:1, and let my cry come unto you. And this is a searing psalm because it deals with the cry coming to God, but it's also in the time of distress and difficulty. So it's the soul's crying out for the greater unity, suffer me not to be separated, but that's often done either in the eagle learning to fly in the currents, or the ship of the soul sailing across the water of time, or of integrating the important role of God, humanity, and nature itself. And so ends part 6 of Ash Wednesday, which then opens the door for each of us to ask ourselves the nature of our journey. What are these poems speaking to us? And the next step, of course, is the Sabbath of the soul, which is open to any of us as we come to deal with Eliot's insights, wisdom, discernment, and multiple metaphors of transformation.